Now start recording. Yep.
All right, let's get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's accounting design workshop. And today we have Eric Weisbrod from the University of Kansas to present a very interesting paper on forecasting earnings using k-nearest neighbors. I'm Estelle Sam. I'm from the Boston University. I'll be moderating this session today. Before I pass the floor to Eric, I have some housekeeping rules. So first of all, if possible, if you can turn on your cameras, that'd be great. In that way, we can see your faces. And secondly, Eric, it's okay to take questions at any point in time during the presentation. So if you have a questions, feel free to use the raise hand functions, or if you can indicate you have a question in the chat box, I will let Eric know there are questions. And finally, please do leave the last 5 minutes uninterrupted so Eric can wrap up his talk. And I think, but you are welcome to stay after the presentation if you have more questions. So I think that's it. And without further ado, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Eric Weisbrod here at the University of Kansas. If you look out the window behind me, you can kind of see Allen Fieldhouse, the home of Jayhawks basketball. They're away at the Sweet 16 right now on the road to the Final Four. But it's still nice here in Lawrence. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present our paper here today. All of us on the team are really big supporters of the Accounting Design Project. I think I'm the fourth one of us to present a paper here. And so I know we're going to get really great feedback. And this is a great time because we recently got an R&R at TAR. So we have two really thoughtful reviews, but we're just starting the process of revising the paper, and any suggestions that we can do to put it over the top for the next round will be really helpful. And like Estelle said, feel free to chime in at any time with questions. So I'll walk you guys through the paper today, but I'm just one small part of this great team that includes Peter Easton, Martin Capon, Steve Monahan, and Harm Shute. Okay, so the paper is pretty straightforward, similar to the title. So we're introducing a new forecasting method to the literature using the k-nearest neighbors algorithm. And then we're going to compare it to other methods and also see if it can be useful to investors by looking at future returns. And so I think we've got a lot to say both about how you can forecast earnings using matching and sort of what that tells you about the earnings process, as well as how to apply this in your study or in other settings where you might need to forecast something. So the basic idea of what we're doing goes back to the 11th century. The idea is, if it looks like a dog and sounds like a dog, it probably is a dog. Just matching things to things that are similar. It's sort of like finding comparables in the real estate market, or if you've seen Nate Silver, he does this with a lot of political settings, like election results in one state might be similar to other states, or a baseball player's performance can be predicted using other baseball players. So I have a very simple example of just what nearest neighbors is. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with this, but just to make sure, let's say you have a data point that you're trying to predict here, this question mark, and you can use nearest neighbors for either classification or regression. In this simple example, we're doing it for classification. So you want to try to figure out if this new data point is going to be a star or a triangle. You can pick however many features you want to match on or variables you want to match on and say, okay, well, let me look at the most similar other data points in those dimensions and choose, one thing you have to decide is how many neighbors you're going to choose. And I'll talk about how we figured that out in our setting. But in this case, if you pick the 3 nearest neighbors, so K is the number of nearest neighbors you're going to match on, if the majority of them are triangles, you'll predict that this observation will be a triangle. So then going directly now to an example of how we apply this in our setting, we vary how many years you should match on and how many neighbors you should choose. And we do sort of a tuning process. We have a holdout sample in the beginning before we start testing the model to do parameter tuning. And the main parameter is how many neighbors you're going to choose. And we also vary how many years of an earnings trend you match on. But in this simple example, I use a 5-year trend and just choose the 10 nearest neighbors just to give a picture of how this works. So I'll actually, we're trying to forecast, we're looking at Walmart in 2010. And in this case, we're trying to forecast their 2011 earnings. And I'll actually start on the bottom real quick. One thing that's always important to point out when I present the paper is that we can only use neighbors that come from the past that are lagged at least 1 year. Because what we do is we match to historical similar firms or firms with a similar trend in earnings historically, and then use what happened in those firms' future to predict what will happen to Walmart in 2011. So if you see, we use 10-year rolling windows, and the neighbors can come from any point that's lagged at least 1 year. And so some of these, we're looking at their trend where, T or we call it S in the paper for them would be 2009, and say, what happened to this firm in 2010? And can we use that to predict what will happen to Walmart in 2011, right? Or we can match to an even older neighbor in 2001 and then see what happened to them in 2002 to predict Walmart in 2011. And so a lot of times, especially a lot of us on the team, we come from an FSA background and have taught that before. And usually when we're talking about valuation multiples or comparable companies, you're thinking about the same point in time. But it's important to note in our setting that all the neighbors that we're matching to come from the past so that we can use their future earnings to predict the subject firm. So then when you look at the top and you put it in event time, so here we've chosen 5 years of past earnings to match on. So they're all very close because they were matched on that. And then when we look 1 year ahead for the different neighbors, at that point, it could spread out because there's no look ahead bias there. And we take the median of these 10 neighbors' earnings as our forecast to what happened to Walmart in 2011. And so the very bold black line, those are Walmart's actual earnings. So you can see our forecast was very close, and we didn't cherry pick this one at all. Every forecast is super close like this. Just joking. Okay, so I'll keep going on, and please feel free to jump in at any point. So as I mentioned, the first part of the paper is sort of how should you apply KNN? Because KNN is a very general algorithm that could be used in a lot of settings. So one thing we have to figure out is what is the best way to apply this well-known algorithm in an earnings forecasting setting. And so we find after trying a bunch of different ways that simply matching on 2 years of earnings trend gives you enough of a growth prediction to get a good forecast, and matching on more neighbors around 90 happens to be better than matching on, say, 5 or 10 close neighbors. And we have some economic intuition for why that is, and I'll get into that as I go along. And then the second research question is, once we optimize internally the KNN forecast, how does it compare to other common forecasting methods? And so we find that KNN is more accurate than other model-based forecasts, such as the HVZ model or prior types of matching forecasts. Like way back in the 90s, Barber and Lyon started doing buckets of size and past performance. And so matching on actual nearest neighbors outperforms that. Ayang, do you have a question?
Yeah, so Eric, I have a two questions. First is, why do you decide to only use one parameter, earnings history? Why don't you consider all the other source of data, historical data, so that we think about big data, like any transactional level data can
Sure.
also help
So,
you identify comparables?
sure. So,
What's the-
that was probably just me speaking unclearly, but we do look at other potential matching variables besides earnings. And we find that a simple match on earnings always performs as well or better than the ones we tried. And I'm sure I'll definitely be welcome suggestions on other variables that we could try matching on. But we try, for example, the variables that are in the HVZ model as potential ones. We do like a DuPont decomposition and match on variables based on the DuPont analysis. We do, we try restricting within industry or within size buckets and matching to firms in the same industry. And we find none of those outperform just a simple match on past earnings trends.
Okay. And my second question is that this is kind of like a very machine-driven approach, right? So I'm thinking about, like, in practice, that there are a lot of analysts are kind of like human experts and try to take advantage of the combination of human expertise and machine. So there's a kind of like a JFE paper by Chelsea Pomar and Charlie Wen. They simply just use the search patterns to see what people are actually picking comparables if they are going to search Walmart. So I think I just want your thoughts on, right now your benchmarks seem to compare to only the machine-driven methodologies, but like, is there any room that you can actually consider the combination of the human experts and the machine? So it's not a horse race between machine and human, it's actually try to create synergies by combining both of them. So, and that potentially will be something kind of like more realistic to what we see in practice. The analyst actually has all those tools, but also has their own expertise about who should be the best comparable history for them to actually to guide them on forecasting.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. I definitely think that one thing that I'll highlight as we go on is that once we match on the neighbors, so once we choose these 90 neighbors, we also can see the dispersion of these 90 neighbors' future earnings. And specifically, a lot of the stuff that we try to do in this paper is we try to make it as robust and non-parametric as possible. So like, we measured the dispersion of the neighbors' future earnings using the interquartile range. And so we find, if the neighbors' future earnings, if they have a wider interquartile range, then the forecast will be more uncertain. And so we don't perform as well. Whereas when the future earnings of the neighbors are less dispersed, when we have like a tighter group of forecasts, then our forecasts perform better. So we have one signal of, let's say you were going to combine this with a human analyst, or a human analyst was going to take the input from our model as a tool that they could use. They can see that they might want to rely more heavily on it when the neighbors are less dispersed. And that's a good suggestion. Could we in our analyses then say, could you do even better if you compared the forecast, or sorry, combine the forecast of our model with, say, analyst forecast or some method that incorporates human search patterns. We haven't gone down that road, but I do like that idea. I think some of it is because there's a lot to cover just in introducing this new method. And so right now we've stuck with forecasting earnings, but you could even apply nearest neighbors to other settings in accounting research. So that's one avenue we've considered going down. And I think the reviewers are pushing us to sort of compare to analysts in the next revision. But I like what you're saying of also trying to sort of join forces. I know there's another management science paper that Ryan Ball has where they combine information from model-based and analyst forecasts.
Thank you.
So Eric, I see there are two questions in chat. One from Jeremy and one from Doran. Can you see them?
Sure, let me open this up. Okay, great. So Jeremiah asked, looking at patterns in the time series of earnings, trying to match individual. Yeah, so I'll answer Jeremiah's question as I go on. It's a little similar to Ayang's initial question of what features we chose to match on. So I would say generally you could think of each year in the past time series of just another variable that we're matching on. And so we can have as many years or as many different variables from the same year. And I'll show you how the matching works across those. And then, oh yeah, that's a great question about macro variables. So we have, not in this version of the paper, but you know, we've gone through a bunch of iterations on this. One thing that's great about having a big 5-person team is that we have a lot of good ideas and we end up trying them all. So we have tried some macro variables in the past, such as, you know, treasury rates or spread, you know, treasury spreads and yield curves and a bunch of different things. And so far, none of them made a big impact. But when we get to the part of the different models, or we thought that should make a difference. So if there's suggestions for other ways we could add that, we would definitely be interested.
Maybe in terms of selecting the sample. So if, for example, at time of recession, you only want to look at previous periods when there was recession, and you want to exclude patterns that we saw during peak times. So instead of like incorporating it as additional variable on which you match, maybe just restrict the histories from which you select based on the value of macro variables.
Okay, thanks. That is a good suggestion. So we've done what you said with industry and size, but not with the macro. So that's definitely something we could try. So we call that stratification when we do that, and we say, what if you restrict the matches to being in the same strata, such as industry strata? So we could try, you know, picking some macro strata, like say whether it's a recession or an expansion or something, and see if that helps. Okay, and then do we have more here? Oh, okay, then can you identify common characteristics? What about fundamentals, cost of care? Yeah, so let me, I'll go through some of the, so I think we are capturing growth in the past time series of earnings. I think that's one key thing that we're doing. And then let me get into how we handle other variables as I go on. Okay, so then I think I've mentioned all the things on this slide. So let me keep going here. And it sounds like a lot of people have a strong background in the prior literature, but I would say we fit in a few places, mainly to the literature on model-based forecast. So a lot of the recent papers have focused on regression-based forecasts. There are some prior papers that use matching, but not using nearest neighbors. So basically just in buckets based on size or industry or past profitability. So I think Barber and Lyon would be the classic paper in that line of literature. And then Blue and Core and Gay, they have a much different research question, but they sort of modernize the Barber and Lyon approach. So we end up using that as one of our comparison models. And then as we've mentioned briefly, prior literature has looked at incorporating industry before with sort of mixed results. Generally, I would say they find it doesn't help. And we find similar things in our setting, that restricting to the same industry doesn't improve the forecast. And then we also look at compared to life cycle stage. And that does seem to be a strong benchmark, but we have slightly more accurate. You know, we find that a lot of the matches end up coming from the same life cycle stage, but it doesn't help to specifically restrict to the same life cycle stage. So one way we interpret that is that, you know, life cycle might be, it's very relevant, but it might be a broader concept than just the Dickinson statement of cash flow classification that we have. Okay, so as I mentioned, one thing we had to figure out is how we're going to proceed. We say, okay, we want to be a superstar. Well, not quite that exciting, but we want to forecast earnings using KNN. How could you do it? And just to figure that out, there's a bunch of questions you have to address. So should you incorporate more variables like you guys have been suggesting, or a longer time series? And there's pros and cons. So you might get more similar firms across more dimensions, but you get the curse of dimensionality that the more dimensions you match on, you might not be as able to match as well along any one dimension, as well as the more data or the longer time series you require might reduce the generalizability of the forecast. And then you also have to choose, once you decide the variables you're going to match on, you have to decide how many neighbors to pick. So the first part of the paper is just defining and tuning those parameters. So to start addressing Jeremiah's question, when we select the nearest neighbors, we select it based on the Euclidean distance of whatever features we match on. So first we standardize the variables so they're comparable. And then you can see where it says N features here. In the example I showed you guys for Walmart, there's basically 5 features, the 5 prior years of earnings. And then you could do as many years as you want, or you could do other features besides earnings. Jeremiah, you have a follow-up?
Well, just a labeling sort of thing you're doing. I think when you say trend, that sounds like you're getting something like a slope or a pattern in prior earnings. So someone that has a different level of earnings could have the same slope and you wouldn't capture that. And so I think you wouldn't capture that as a match, right? Because the earnings level would be the same. And so I think being careful about saying trend is, a little bit important, because there are other ways that you can match past trends, right? There's some, for example, some functional data analysis that they specifically match the trend, not the level. So I just think it's a little bit in labeling and being careful in how you state it, because if you say trend, it sounds like you might use some other techniques as well. Yeah. And I don't know which would be better or worse, right? I mean, this seems intuitive to me, and it seems like it's close to a trend, right? But not quite a trend. That was my only point.
So we have thought about some of these things, and we even tried, so what we end up, one way to describe what we end up doing is time series nearest neighbor matching. And so we did try some specific algorithms that use a time series type of distance. I think it's called dynamic time warping. So it's just modifying this Euclidean distance measure to take into account that these come from a time series. And we found that that didn't make a huge improvement over what we're doing here, but just to sort of so I guess this one is sort of easy because it was a linear trend, but by matching on the level of each of these years in the trend, you end up matching the trend. But I have one of these case studies that it's not actually in this version of the paper, but it's here in my slides. Let me, oops, go back a little bit here. So you can see this one has a really curvy trend, but we do end up matching it, relatively well, I would say. So even though it might be a language thing, or there could be different ways we could implement this, when we've thought about it, we do think we're doing a decent job of capturing the prior trends.
So I guess this is my other point, is trend can mean many different things. So that was just my point. So trend, what you're capturing, I think, is intercept and slope, in this sort of what you're looking at, right? You're capturing the average level and the trend that they're following, because you could have a trend, for example, that the pattern looks exactly the same as what you have there, but it starts at 0.1 instead of down at 0.02. And so I think that means something a little bit different than just what I tend. So when I teach trend stuff in my class, I'm saying, look at the slope and what is happening to the slope, right? And I think you're doing, I'm guessing you have a case to say this is stronger than just looking at a slope. Because I mean, my intuition would be this matches better than that. But anyway, I just think,
Yeah, that's a good
by
point.
saying trend, it's not exactly the same, right? You might be doing more.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess, doing it this way, we're capturing both, in a sense, profitability and trend. And so I think you're right, we could be more explicit about that. Now I understand, thank you. Let me go ahead and just jump back real quick. Okay, so I'm gonna go here. Okay, so I think we've talked about this, and then just going through the mechanics of how we do this. What we're talking about right now is how we're gonna choose the parameters. So choose the variables to match on, and how many neighbors. So we do that using this holdout sample from 1979 to 1995. And then when we compare once we choose the optimal model and parameters, we test the performance against competing models over this period from 1998 to 2018. And within each of those settings, we always train the model over the prior 10 years of data. We basically roll forward 1 year at a time using the prior 10 years as an estimation sample. Is there a new question in the chat?
Yes, there's another new question about the weighting question from Hangul.
Sure. So we haven't specifically weighted more recent years more heavily, but the one thing that we've done in relation to that is we're sort of sticking with this 10-year window because it's similar to prior literature, and because people have the intuition that maybe the past 10 years should matter. But we actually, in some cases, have just allowed the window to continue to expand and expand, so that you have potential neighbors that are even farther and farther and farther back in history. And we end up finding that performs slightly better, so that it doesn't matter if the matches are only taken from recent history. They could come from very far in the past. And I mean, maybe it's somewhat similar to what Doran is saying. We should be allowing, even if it was a long time ago, we should be allowing similar macroeconomic settings to enter the selection of the firms. But yeah, we could look at, I should ask my co-op, there's a way that we could specifically weight based on time, but I would say our general intuition so far is that it's actually the opposite. It's actually the more potential time periods that you can choose from, the better the neighbors end up being. Okay.
So Eric, related to your earliest point, so think about that this pandemic, like if you have 100 years of the turning window, then we have Spanish flu pandemic probably 100 years ago. But if you only have 10 years, there's no pandemic during those 10 years for us to forecast for 2020, right?
Yeah,
I got a sense of it. It doesn't have to be the recent one, but has to be a similar episode like the round talk about, like, yeah, if this is a financial crisis, we need to go to 1929. If it's the pandemic, we go to 1911.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Unfortunately, we don't quite have the 1920 Spanish flu in our data. We don't
11, I think.
11,
11,
oh, sorry,
yeah.
1911. We don't quite have it back that far, but that was a great analogy. Steve on our team, he likes to also use an example that he's done with his students that Chipotle right now might not be comparable to McDonald's right now. But if you look at McDonald's back when it was growing, like say in the 50s and 60s, when it was that earlier stage, then maybe it would be a better match for Chipotle right now. But yeah, I agree with you for sure. So I do want to make sure I get to the different variables we consider and everything. Briefly, I would say one thing that's nice about what we end up with the basic earnings KNN forecast is that we really just require 1 year of additional data beyond what the random walk would require. And so it's really broadly applicable. You don't need data on accruals or dividends, or you don't need analyst coverage. That's one thing so we end up getting to a much smaller sample in our testing window, but that's mostly because of the competing models, data requirements, and filters that we apply, not related to the applicability of our method. And then another thing that we've tried to do to be robust is to compare multiple accuracy measures. So we have the mean forecast error, the median, we have a mean squared error, as well as if we just do a very small trim of the outliers in the mean squared error, we find that ends up being a bit more robust. So we also have a trimmed mean squared error. Okay, so now to start getting to the fun stuff, this figure describes our parameter tuning process. So again, we had to decide some way to select the best model or the best number of neighbors to match on. And so we ended up just choosing the mean absolute forecast error as sort of our tuning variable, that whichever model gives the best mean absolute forecast error, we'll select that one. So this graph, again, we did compare to other things besides earnings, but in this particular graph, we're tuning K, the number of neighbors, and M, how many years of prior earnings history to match on. And so what we end up doing is looking across, we go all the way up to 300 neighbors, but it starts sort of flattening out once you get to 100 or so. And so then we just pick the set of parameters that gives the smallest mean absolute forecast error. So it ends up being 2 years of earnings history and about 90 neighbors. And you can see, matching on more years of history, it sort of, it minimizes the error with less neighbors, but it never does as well as a shorter time series. And in this setting, we require everybody to have 5 years of potential data. So it's like all on the same sample, but then later on, once we pick, only needing 2 years, we can broaden the sample up. Okay, and so this is one thing that was surprising to us coming from an FSA setting. We thought maybe it would be better to pick, let's say 5 very similar firms rather than say 90 peers. So why does it do better to pick more largest neighbors? One way we tried to provide the intuition behind this, so in sort of a statistical or machine learning sense, there's a bias variance trade-off here, where if you just pick a few very similar neighbors, then sometimes the median of those neighbors will be very close, but sometimes it could be farther away. So even though these are more similar to the subject firm, there's a lot of variance in the forecast that comes from those. Whereas here we simulate a distribution that's actually a bit biased, say toward the population mean rather than the specific subject firm we're trying to forecast. But because there's more peers that we select, the variance of that forecast will be lower. And so even though there's a slight bias towards the mean in the distribution, we get a more accurate forecast. Another way we try giving some intuition behind why KNN is useful is we sort of decompose what we're doing. So there's a couple of things we're doing here. Like one thing is that we're matching on neighbors. Another thing is that we're selecting the median of their future earnings as our forecast. And I've been focusing on 1 year ahead. We also do it with 2 year and 3 year ahead and find that it works well also. So decomposing the different parts of what we're doing is, instead of matching on an actual feature like earnings, what if we just picked random other firms and just said, well, if you match to 100 random other firms, how well do you do? And so that's this green line up here. and you don't get a very good forecast, obviously. And then another thing is we're taking the median earnings of the peers. What if instead of the median earnings of the peers, you just took the median earnings across the economy last year? And that wouldn't give you a very good forecast either. That's this next line. And then I think the strongest benchmark is probably the random walk, right? And so we say, what is it that allows our method to beat the random walk? And so this blue line here is we take nearest neighbors, but instead of looking at the next year of those neighbors, we just say, give me that year that we matched on, like year T of our subject firm compared to the median of year T across the neighbors. So it's very similar to the random walk, but instead of just using the subject as its own match, just use the median of its neighbors of this year as your forecast of next year. And that only slightly beats the random walk. It really, you need the combination of both matching on the neighbors as well as extrapolating, the subsequent growth. So firms that were in a similar earnings, I guess we should say both profitability and trend, as Jeremiah pointed out to you, really, if we extrapolate what happened to them the following year, that's the best forecast of what will happen to you. Okay, so then now I'm getting to Ayang's question. Most of the things I've been showing you so far are just selecting, how many years of past earnings to use, but we tried 4 different combinations of DuPont-based variables. We tried various breakdowns of the HVZ variables, only including, I think one of them only includes accruals, one of them includes all the HVZ variables. And so this type of table you see throughout the paper. In the first row, we have the actual mean absolute forecast error of our model, and this is scaled by market value of equity, and then it's in percent. So this is like 6.8% market value is the mean absolute forecast error. And then after this, these are differences between our optimal KNN model and the comparison ones. So positive numbers here mean larger errors, significant, and if it has stars, it's a significantly larger error. So more accurate would be a negative number. There's only one here along one dimension. One of these HVZ models can do slightly better at the median, but it's not significant. And so we say, it's better off just sticking with a simple earnings model. Nothing else we tried could beat it, and most other things did worse. And then, so I think this just summarizes. Oh, go ahead, Ayang.
So that this question may be not directly related to your purpose, but like what you talk about is that if we want to forecast earnings, then it's better to use historical earnings from comparable firms rather than using less direct variables, for example, macro indicators or DuPont decomposition, right? And then it got me think about, that means that the underlying accounting system producing earnings needs to be stable over time, right? In the 70s and 80s, the US GAAP will be somehow very similar to the US GAAP we have today. So the earnings actually capture similar types of the transactions or have a similar process to actually report those transactions. So it's a long question, but like I think I want to see, can you predict the recent years of the non-GAAP earnings? And then to see somehow the non-GAAP earnings has different compositions of elements. And then somehow do you also find something similar in terms of those parameters that you will still have 2 years, 9 nearest, given that the measurement is different?
Yeah, so that's really great question. Thank you. So first, maybe to start with what you said at the end, I do think that this method would work well for non-GAAP earnings. Right now, we are just going from CompuStat and taking earnings before special items. But I think in the revision, we are going to try, for example, street earnings, because the referees are pushing us to compare against analyst forecasts. So we need to be forecasting the same underlying earnings measure, right? So we're gonna try that. And then regarding what you said, that's a great point that the accounting system has changed. And so one thing you emailed me leading up to the presentation is, can we say anything about policy or about accounting design in this paper? And, you know, I don't think we have super strong takeaways, but in that framework, I would say the accounting system seems to be good enough, at least in this purpose that we're trying to get at, that if you just think of earnings as a summary measure of performance. Now, I know there's a lot of great research about how earnings have changed over time and maybe better or worse at capturing different types of firms' business models over time. But at least in this general forecasting setting we're looking at, we do think that GAAP earnings, you know, regardless of the changes over time, are doing a decent job as a summary measure of performance.
And I think on top of that, your results also tell us that idiosyncratic firm-specific manipulation or incentives somehow doesn't really matter in this setting, right? Because your comparable firm historically may want to actually report earnings in one direction or the other due to their compensation contracts or all the other frictions, but somehow it still works very well many, many years later for you to forecast another firm.
Yeah, and I think, and as much as I would love to be able to speak to policy or GAAP or the accounting system, I think we might have more contributions toward, you know, on the statistical side or the data machine learning side, that compared to either the random walk or a linear regression model, matching has some advantages. So first of all, you know, we're matching non-linearly. So a lot of these regression models like HVZ or even the simple earnings persistence model, they're sort of forcing a linear trend or linear projection on these data. Whereas matching, we can get, you know, a better non-parent. And if you've read any of the recent machine learning papers, a lot of them are along those lines, that we can incorporate non-linearities and things like that. And the other thing that I think our method is adding beyond the random walk is, one thing I've noticed just personally working with the data is the place the random walk does poorly is if the current year is a weird year. So maybe you did take a big bath this year, or you just had some special items or a one-off transaction, then in that particular case, this year's earnings are not going to do well. However, as long as you allow a couple years match and then see, you know, other firms that they might have a weird year this year, see what happened to them next year, they might revert back to their normal trend. And so to use the median of the neighbors rather than your own earnings helps out if the current year is a weird year. I see a few people have their hands up now. I guess Estelle, why don't you help me figure out?
Yeah, so Charles, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? And then Stephen after that.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just one idea to kind of figuring out like the filtering. I mean, I think it makes sense that if you start to, you know, you run into this curse of dimensionality with KNN, but maybe instead of actually like filtering on industry or size like that, could you somehow just like run weights, you know, kind of overweight or underweight based on different industries, so you're not throwing out data, because obviously that's going to make it harder to find good matches just in general. But if you can somehow overweight same industry or overweight more similar time, that you can maybe improve it. And then obviously that would maybe mean that you extend it beyond you know, 90 firms. Just kind of, you know, another idea to try to maybe get around this issue of like, you know, does just using everything actually matter?
Yeah, that's great. And that'll definitely be a big takeaway from today, that 2 or 3 people mentioned waiting. So we're going to look into that. I think, Stephen, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yes, a couple of points, I guess. First of all, this is very reminiscent, of course, of the method of comparables in valuation, where you match on PE ratios, for example, to get a price of a given firm. And we have a lot of criticisms of that, of course. But I was thinking, Now, the PE ratio is an expectation of future earnings as long as you control for the risk, okay? So one way to match on it would match on PE ratios for firms which are deemed to be in the same risk class, same beta or something, okay? That would be useful, because you see how assuming market efficiency, of course, that gives you the expectation of the future earnings, given all this information that other people are being asking you to suggesting you might add. It's interesting because that price is based on not just next year's earnings, but the whole stream of future earnings. Okay, and that's what we're interested in, actually. But it's also could be interesting in the sense that, you know, if you actually get different results from your method versus the PE ratio for the forward earnings, it could be indication of market inefficiency. Okay, that could be a trading rule. So I think that might be that seems to be the PE ratio is an expectation of future earnings, given all information, given market efficiency. Okay, you've got to control for risk, for the PE ratio is affected by the risk to the earnings also. Once we've initialized on risk, that seems to be another way of going, which would be similar to the method of comparables we use for valuation. So that's just a suggestion, but it may lead to some insights, but validation of your model or an inconsistency in the pricing with what you come up with, which would indicate a trading strategy. The other thing is, I like in these things to see type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay, we have all the earnings quality literature and so on, and people give these metrics, but they never tell us what the type 1 and type 2 errors are. Okay, so investigation of when this does it for you and when it doesn't do it for you, and what sort of errors it generates would be also very helpful relative to competing ways of doing it.
Yeah, we're with you 100%, and I know Peter and Steve look at it very similar to how you described. One thing that I've sort of glossed over is that we have to scale earnings by something when we're matching, and we're currently scaling the earnings by market value of equity. So Peter's noted a few times that in a sense it boils down to matching on PE ratios. So we should absolutely look into risk as matching variables and figure out a way to do that. You also gave me a great lead into the last part of the paper that I need to get to given my time left. So we are looking at places where our model does better or worse. And then we do have a potential trading strategy. Right now, we have a trading strategy, but I also take your point that we could be capturing the market expectations if the markets are rational. So that's one thing the reviewers are asking us to do, is to look into ERCs and things like that, rather than a trading strategy. But let me go ahead and move ahead a little bit to lead into some of the things you mentioned. So I brought up briefly this idea of the interquartile range. So one thing that we really focus on of when our model should do better or worse is when the future earnings of the matched companies are more or less dispersed. And so then intuitively we find, so these are quintiles where 1 would be the tightest interquartile range of the future earnings of the peers, and 5 would be the widest. And so along here we have forecast error going this way, and the dots are the medians. So of course, this monotonically, the median forecast error goes up, as well as the distribution of the earnings forecast gets wider with a wider IQR. And then so the dependent measure here is the forecast error from our model in the first column. This is what I call an absolute forecast error. But then we also have relative forecast errors between our model and the random walk, our model and the Jan inverse life cycle, and our model in HVZ. And so you can see when IQR is larger, our forecast error is larger, so it performs worse. It also performs worse relative to other models, so you wouldn't want to select it in that case. We do have, thinking about what Stephen was saying, we do have like book to price, right now that's affecting the accuracy of our model. So maybe we should be thinking more about how to incorporate that in the match or not. Some things, one thing I mentioned that's a strength of our model is that we sort of build in the next year of growth. We extrapolate growth a year. That doesn't work as well for loss firms. And so then, because we're usually adding a positive trend in there, which the loss firm might not immediately revert back to profitability. So it works better for profitable growing firms. And then I know I have limited time left, so I don't want to go into every variable individually, but this is to me one of the most interesting parts, as Stephen mentioned, of saying this isn't going to work the best every single time. So when is it going to give better or worse matches? And so then we incorporate that into a potential trading strategy. So first, we do a basic Ball and Brown type of idea, except forward looking. So if we could predict ex ante which firms are going to have the largest increases in earnings and buy those, and then sell the firms that are expected to have the largest decreases in earnings over the next year. Just doing that on its own, we can just get marginally significant abnormal returns. And so that the rest of this table in the paper controls for all the Fama French 5 risk factors. But really where it does well is if we control the strategy between high and low IQR observations. So here, once we include this interaction, this becomes, in a sense, the hedge. So we standardize everything here so that this can be interpreted somewhat as the hedge return for that strategy among the low IQR portfolio, and then compared to the high IQR portfolio. So we find significant positive abnormal returns for our best forecasts, and then it actually ends up becoming negative for the highest IQR. And we've looked at this in portfolios. So if you did sort of a hedge of hedges, you could also profit on the difference in accuracy. Ayun?
And so there are I'm sorry. Yeah, no, that's fine. So Arlene can go first. And there's another question in the chat from Zihan.
Okay.
So just a quick kind of suggestion. I think, have you thought about like actually picking K and M, number of years, and also number of firms by industry or by some of the characteristics? So your IQR, if you can actually analyze, for example, new economy industries probably will have a greater dispersion, right, among those 90 comparable firms, because historically we just don't have internet firms or those social media firms. And those potentially the number of years will be much shorter, but if you are talking about industrial firms, so one thought would be just your selection of K and M somehow is not universal across all the firms, but actually partitioned based on industry or some of the risk or firm characteristics. So kind of related to what Steve and Charlie talk about, but I try to sort them into portfolios and I have portfolio specific K and M selections.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So right now we do, for every different version of the KNN we tried, we tune it separately. And so when I showed the DuPont one, that could have a different K and a different M than the basic earnings one. And we always find the most optimal tuning for each, model we run. So we did tune, when we stratify by industry, we tune that separately. But now that you mention it, I don't know that we allowed every single industry to tune separately. Like we just tuned the overall process of industry stratification separately. So that's a good suggestion.
There's another comment in the chat.
Let me look, I'll look at the chat right now. Okay, so then if the K&N forecast of the medium firm, useful compare these medium firm years. Yeah, yes, and I sort of couldn't fit everything in, but if you have the paper from the download, if you look at table 3 of the paper, we do provide some descriptives of, we pick these 90 firms that we matched on, and then we say how many of them are from the same life cycle? How many of them are from the same industry? How similar are they in terms of size? So we try to give some sense of the matches and whether they come from. So we find about 36% of the 90 matches come from the same life cycle, and an even smaller portion from the same industry. And they're usually separated by about 5 years in time. And then I know I'm getting to my last 5 minutes here, so I don't want to go over and take your time. I'm really grateful for all the suggestions that you guys have given. I would say, I think the thing that I think people have been pretty receptive that this could be a useful way to forecast earnings. And then the main pushback we've gotten is, who cares? Why does this matter? And so, the things at the end with the trading signal and some of the stuff Stephen was mentioning, we're trying to emphasize that and expand that. But I do want to point out that just in terms of methodology, I hope that you'll find this useful for other settings in your research. So we've started with earnings forecasting, but the idea of using KNN in an accounting setting, we haven't seen a lot out there. So maybe using this to match on accruals and figure out methods of discretionary accruals. Or I know my job on the next slide is to introduce next week's presenter, machine learning for accounting conservatism. We encourage you to consider KNN, in addition to these more complex methods such as the random forest or gradient boosting. We tried a lot of those, and we found that this simple non-parametric approach is powerful. And another great thing is this built-in indicator, like this built-in ex-ante indicator of how dispersed are the peers as a measure of when this is going to work better or worse. So then I think my very last slide has, I should definitely note for next week, the time will be an hour earlier. And then you get a real machine learning paper presented by Edwidge.
Eric, I think Doran have a last comment in the chat.
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, and yeah, I'm very grateful for any follow-up comments that you guys have. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle.
Thanks very much for being here.